Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. Richard, we're going to kind of continue a conversation that we started in yesterday's podcast. We recorded a podcast about the relationship between sugar and stress, really, and diabetes.
Right.
Cortisol and diabetes. And that podcast went out yesterday on Friday. And after we recorded that podcast, we found this other article that talks about the relationship between sugar and Alzheimer's.
Right. When I first saw this, I looked at it and I looked at it again, because I thought, wow, sugar and Alzheimer's. And I was thinking about yesterday's podcast. And I thought, this is an interesting one because you and I talk, I almost said endlessly, about sugar not causing ADHD.
Right.
It's not the cause of ADHD.
Right.
And, it's been refuted year after year after year, but
right.
people keep believing that it's that there's a link. There's a link, but it's indirect.
Right.
So then I see this, and I said, "Wait a minute, sugar and Alzheimer's. Let's see what this is about."
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's really fascinating, and I think that in yesterday's podcast we even mentioned that the research is starting to talk about this and demonstrate this relationship between sugar, but more particularly diabetes, and Alzheimer's. And so it was very timely that this article was published in the Atlantic. And it was just published last week.
I'm starting to smile, and I apologize because you're looking at me like, what's he smiling about? Yeah. What he's smiling about is, before you were born, now listen to the rest of this sentence. Before you were born, I read a book, which means, wow, how old is he? Before you were born, I read a book called Sugar Blues.
Right.
I mean, I don't know when that book was published. It must have been, 50s, 60s. I don't know when it was written. But it was very, very early in my... So anyway, that was probably in the 70s.
That you read
and it was called Sugar Blues. And it was all about the damage that sugar does to your body. It's the first indication that sugar did anything. So let's say that was 40 years ago. The studies continue to mount up. And they mount up, and they mount up, and they mount up. And yet people have this resistance to believing that sugar or carbohydrates, which convert, are a problem.
Right.
And yet the evidence is overwhelming, and it's probably been around for 50 years.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And then you see this connection, and you say, wow.
Right.
With Alzheimer's too. Right.
Now this is a very well written article that covers the science in pretty good detail, but yet understandable detail. So I think that most people would have an okay time, kind of digging through this. Right. But it walks us through this relationship in very clear terms. Right. And I think that I certainly think it's an article that most need to read, especially if you have a family history of Alzheimer's or dementia.
If you have a history of diabetes, hyperglycemia. And my daughter is 22 and has hypoglycemia. She becomes hypoglycemic. So that's a risk factor.
Right.
Okay. If you have easy hypoglycemia, a little bit of a risk factor. Your body's telling you something.
Right.
Okay. But this is a very accessible explanation of a very complicated topic. Endocrinology is a very complicated topic, always has been for me, because of the chemistry involved.
Oh, yeah.
And there are enzymes and proteins and things that we typically we're not familiar with.
Right.
Okay. But this article really does make it very accessible. Yeah. So if you're interested at all in the elderly, in Alzheimer's, dementia, and diet, this is an excellent article to put in your packet.
Right. Absolutely. So just a couple of definitional things.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're doing that.
Yeah. So when we're talking about high carb diets, I think that one of the things that we have to first recognize is that when we're talking about that, we're typically talking about high carb, high simple carb.
Right.
So like breads and pastas and those kinds of things.
Donuts and pizza crusts and things.
Right. What we typically refer to as junk food. The reason that I'm differentiating that is because vegetables, for example, can be very high in carbohydrates, very high in, but they're complex carbohydrates. Right. And so your body processes them very differently. Well, not very differently, just much more slowly, because there's a great deal of fiber in those food stuffs.
That's right.
And so between vegetables and fruits and things like that, while there is a lot of carbohydrates, the fiber helps balance that out so that your body processes it a little bit differently.
Right. You can actually subtract the grams of fiber from the grams of carbohydrates.
From your total grams of carbohydrates.
Right. And it reduces the carbohydrate load.
Yeah.
So the fiber is the essential difference there.
Right. But with this, we are talking about whole foods. So not like fruit juices or even vegetable juices for that matter. You know, when they go through the juicing process, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the fiber is removed.
Discarded.
Yeah.
Right.
Because through that process. It is absolutely different when you're juicing at home and those kinds of things. But, you know, by and large, the canned or bottled stuff of juice that you buy at the store, usually the fiber is not as high as it would be for the amount of carbohydrates that are in the juice.
Right. And we do the same thing with bread. You know, we talk about whole grain bread. Well, whole grain bread is you take the entire kernel, you grind it up, and you make bread with that.
Right.
That's not how we make bread in our country. We crack that open, dump out the powder, throw away everything else, and use the powder, which we call flour.
Right.
Okay. So when people refer to bread as the staff of life, they're referring to bread made from a whole kernel, because the whole kernel is where the nutrition is.
Right.
Okay. But we toss that out because, and the reason we toss it out is it gummed up the machines.
Right.
It got in the way of the machines, and so manufacturers, processors, found that if they got rid of that, it saved the wear and tear in their machines.
Right. Yeah. So there's that first little just caveat or definition. The second thing is that we're going to talk about this in terms of diabetes, or in terms of diabetes. And so there are we know about type 1 diabetes. Yeah. Type 1 diabetes is autoimmune.
That. Right. You're born with it. Okay.
Right. Oftentimes we refer to it as childhood diabetes or childhood onset diabetes.
And the problem is
with the autoimmune system.
But you don't make enough insulin.
Right.
Your pancreas doesn't produce. You're just born with this.
Right. Underperforming.
Right. And so your pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin to break down the
glucose.
The glucose
the sugar.
That's in the carbohydrate.
Right.
Okay. So your body produces glucose, which it needs.
Right.
Okay, that's a brain fuel. But you're born with this disorder, and you don't break down.
Right.
You don't produce enough insulin.
Right.
And so keep that in mind.
Right.
I'm not as familiar with this as you are. So I was reading this, I said, okay, so type 1, they don't produce enough insulin.
Right.
Okay. Now,
and oftentimes type 1, there's type 1 is, generally speaking, not reversible. I mean,
you can't do anything.
That's lifelong treatment, typically. Right.
Okay.
Type 2 diabetes sometimes is referred to as acquired diabetes or diet-based or insulin-resistant diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is caused by and large by your diet.
And how does that happen?
What happens is when we consume chronically consume sugars, high
over
volumes.
a lifetime, years and years and years of these high carbohydrate, embedded sugar, over the years, what happens?
It for lack of a better sort of analogy, our pancreas just gets wore out.
You wear it out. That's right. You overwork it, and it gets tired.
Yeah.
Just like any other organ in your body.
Right.
It gets tired. People who drink too much, they destroy their liver. People who they destroy their kidneys because you're asking them to do more than it's built to do.
Right.
And so you damage the pancreas. Hence, it produces less insulin.
Right.
But you're causing that by your diet rather than being born with it.
Right.
So type 2 is you're not producing enough insulin because you've damaged the pancreas. Sometimes called there's a late onset diabetes. It just, because of your age, it just wears out like everything does.
Now, the concern, of course, with type 2 diabetes is that we are seeing a massive increase in the prevalence and identification of type 2 diabetes in kids. And that's from, as we're sitting here talking about, this is something that happens over the course of a lifetime or years. We now have kids that are, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old who are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes.
Right.
And so imagine the volume of sugars and work that their pancreas is doing through those, first relatively few years.
Yeah, because we were thinking that this develops after middle age, that you wear it out over a 30 or 40 year period. Now we're seeing kids wearing out their pancreas in 10 or 11 years, which is, unheard of.
Right.
I mean, this didn't exist a short time ago. Children didn't get type 2 diabetes.
Right.
But in type 2 diabetes, your pancreas isn't producing enough insulin, so you take insulin supplements of some type. So now you're adding insulin to the system. And I'm belaboring this a little bit because type 1 diabetes, you don't produce enough insulin. Type 2 diabetes, but it's insulin resistant.
Well, type 2 diabetes, it happens because it's congenital. You're born with it because your pancreas can't do it. Type 1.
Right. Type 2, and you take insulin. You worn it out a little bit, so you add insulin, either by pills or injection.
Right.
So you add insulin to your system.
Right.
So in one case, you're not producing enough insulin, type 1. In type 2, there's insulin present, but it's added to.
Right.
Okay.
Now, where the new research is really coming is this idea of type 3 diabetes.
Right.
And type 3 diabetes is a new moniker for Alzheimer's. And we've known for a long time that as we get older, if we have type 2 diabetes, our risk for developing Alzheimer's significantly increases.
Right.
And so we always thought, or tended to think, that there was this sort of path to Alzheimer's that traveled through diabetes type 2.
Right.
Well, there's some new research coming out now that says, well, maybe not.
Right.
Maybe for some people they travel through type 2 diabetes, but there are those who don't have type 2 diabetes that develop Alzheimer's, but it still appears to be related to insulin and sugar intake. And so that's why they're talking about this type 3 diabetes.
Right. And that is really it sent everybody in a new direction.
Right.
When this thing, because endocrinologists knew that people with diabetes develop dementia sooner and at higher rates than people who don't have diabetes. So over time, you just realize this. You see married couples, and one of them has diabetes and develops dementia long before the other person does. And so, but nobody quite knew why this was happening. But they did know that there was some connection between between dementia and, how would you say that, diabetes or insulin, or where was the initial connection?
I think it was with insulin and sugar intake in general. But I think, one more definitional thing that I think we need to throw in there is what we're going to refer to as, between dementia and Alzheimer's. And I think that let's talk about that real quickly. Dementia is a very broad category. And technically speaking, dementia was the diagnostic category in the DSM-4. In the DSM-5, it's not referred to that way anymore. It's referred to as cognitive decline or neurocognitive impairments. Right. And but it's a broad category that actually has or contains several specific diagnoses. Right. Alzheimer's is one of them. Right. But so is dementia with Lewy bodies and vascular dementia. And dementia associated with Parkinson's and dementia associated with HIV. Right. So there's lots of different types of dementia that are caused by different things. Right. So vascular dementia, of course, is a dementia that's caused by decreased blood volume to different regions of the brain. Dementia with Lewy bodies has to do with these things called Lewy bodies that get into your brain and interfere with cognitive functioning. So when it comes to Alzheimer's is a very specific type of dementia. It is one of the most prevalent types. But the real challenge with Alzheimer's is that unlike Lewy bodies or vascular dementia or some of these others, it is a little bit more difficult to diagnose because you can't really diagnose it until after the person passes.
Right, on autopsy.
On autopsy, right. Because Alzheimer's is a form of dementia that is caused by these things called plaques and tangles. And we won't get into the biochemistry too much, but the tangles are, there's these protein, our body recycles things, right? So when we use a protein, our body uses it. Hey, that's great. And then it takes that protein and it breaks it down so that it can use those pieces again to create other proteins or create other...
I'm smiling because when you said, we're not going to explain this too much, but as soon as you went there, no, you're going to have to explain this now.
I think that the science behind it is so fascinating.
It really is.
So,
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, sorry.
But so we have these proteins.
Right.
The proteins break up
right.
into smaller pieces.
Right. And they're supposed to break up into certain types of pieces so that those pieces can then be used again in other...
reassembled and reused
and
go on and do another task.
Exactly. To help form like RNA and DNA and all that kind of stuff. So unfortunately, there are circumstances where some of those proteins, amyloid proteins, do not break up in the right place. They break in the wrong place, and now those pieces are not usable.
That's right. It's not place-like location.
Right.
They break up in the wrong part of the protein, and so they're not able to reassemble themselves.
Right. And so then those pieces start to cluster together. And that creates our plaques and tangles. So,
which is junk. It's really just like debris. That gets in the way and messes stuff up.
Right. And so what will happen is they will accumulate in different parts of the brain. Oftentimes the first areas that are impacted are the hippocampus and some of the other core areas of the brain that are really important for memory.
Well, they make the one of the areas that's particularly vulnerable is the hippocampus, and as it turns out, the hippocampus makes new memories.
Right.
So that's why you get this characteristic memory deficit of, I can't remember what I did this morning, but I can remember what I did in high school.
Years ago. Right. And so the hippocampi are oftentimes affected. But then it does get into the cortex and it starts to affect frontal lobe, which impacts decision making and executive functioning skills and emotional regulation and all those kinds of things. And so that's why we see some of those behavioral changes with it. So again, fascinating stuff. There's actually a really cool documentary that was a series on HBO a number of years ago that kind of walks through a lot of this stuff in great detail. So I would definitely, we're not getting paid by HBO, but if you so choose, check that out. It's really good information.
But to put us back on track, we're talking about, in this article, they're talking about dementia in general because there is a cognitive decline. But there also seems to be a specific relationship between sugar and Alzheimer's, that subtype of dementia. And that's what I found fascinating about this article, because when I first saw the title, I thought, okay, this is going to talk about Alzheimer's specifically. But as the article went on, they also introduced this notion of general cognitive decline. Doesn't necessarily have to be the Alzheimer's type, but general cognitive decline, higher rates, and more severe because of sugar. Right.
And remember, we mentioned this in yesterday's podcast. We were talking about calcium, right? When insulin is in there, or more specifically, when cortisol is in high prevalence or presence in our system, it affects our calcium volumes, and so that interferes with neuron functioning.
Calcium's the enemy,
right?
You know, but it's the cortisol that messes with the calcium, and the calcium is what causes the trouble.
So if you guys are taking notes, we got sugar, diabetes, Alzheimer's, calcium, cortisol. We can just go down the list.
We said endocrinology is a very complex process.
Very
okay, so again, we're talking about our diet, which is very high in sugar, is creating diabetes at higher rates and in earlier ages.
Right.
Okay, and it also is creating cognitive decline.
Right.
Our diet is causing cognitive decline.
Right. So this came from a longitudinal study that was published in a journal called Diabetologia.
Yeah, that's a presumptive title.
That's a challenging title.
Not a good title, but a fabulous study.
Right.
I mean, they studied how many people? Like
5,189 people.
10 years.
For 10 years.
I mean, that is a piece of research work.
Right.
I mean,
and they found that people with high blood sugar had a faster rate of cognitive decline than those with normal blood sugar.
So when you go have these blood tests done and your doctor says your blood sugar is elevated, you better really listen.
Right.
Because the next thing that should come out of that doctor's mouth is, and there's a relationship between.
Right. Because what they interestingly found is that when your blood sugar is higher, you have a higher risk for cognitive decline.
Right.
Even if it's not high enough to be considered diabetes.
That's right. That's the
new key.
The alarming part of this, what stopped me in my tracks. And it said, now we're not talking about diabetes.
Right.
You don't have to have that degree of illness.
Right.
Okay. You just have to have elevated blood sugar.
Right.
And that's sufficient to send you into cognitive decline.
Right. Yeah.
That's scary.
It is. It is scary because, again, as you were just saying, the standard American diet is very high in sugars.
And you have these hidden sugars. The problem is we eat processed foods, and processed foods have sugar.
Right.
Or the beverages that we drink.
Right. Some of the biggest ones that we need to be watching for, of course, is like high fructose corn syrup and corn syrup in general. And I was looking at a label of something the other day. The first two ingredients were corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup, and it wasn't corn syrup. Like I thought, it was a I think it was a candy or something. I was looking at it because I was kind of wanting to get an idea of what ingredients go into those things, and but it was a fruit candy, and those were the first two
you were getting
ingredients.
Instead of oranges, you could eat this candy.
Yeah, so if we pull this together, what we're saying is that there's adequate research coming out now to really support the notion that when a person has chronically especially elevated blood sugar, they put themselves at elevated risk for cognitive decline.
That's right.
Generally speaking, there is a slight cognitive decline that happens naturally, even if you're perfectly healthy, you have no issues or no problems or anything. There is, but we have come to accept a level of cognitive decline that I think is much more excessive than what we should be accepting. We believe, we think about, great grandma or great grandpa or something, and we see it and we say, oh, well, he's, in his 70s or he's in his 80s, and, so he's slowing down, he's not thinking as quickly. To some extent that does happen,
right.
But we are much more accepting. We are accepting a much more significant cognitive decline than we really should be, and this is probably at least part of the reason.
Higher rates, more severe,
right,
and earlier onset.
Right.
Okay. I wanted to mention one thing about this relationship between specifically Alzheimer's and the sugar, because one of the things that had some interesting statistics and said that it's the insulin degrading enzyme Because when you
Right.
produce insulin, you produce it to do its job.
Right.
Once it does its job, then it's degraded by something.
Right.
And the something that degrades it is an enzyme.
Right.
Okay, it's called an insulin degrading enzyme. Well, that same insulin degrading enzyme breaks down not only insulin,
Right.
but also amyloid. And amyloid,
We mentioned this a minute ago.
right, is what causes the Alzheimer. It's
Right.
the amyloid plaques that you mentioned earlier.
Right.
That's what's not getting broken down.
Right.
Okay. So it's a complicated chemical process, but if you think about the steps, it's you produce insulin, you produce too much insulin, and so the enzymes can't break it down.
Right.
But the reason I mention this is because in type 1 diabetes, you don't have insulin. In type 2 diabetes, you have too much insulin. And what got this woman started on the study is, how can you have both?
Right.
How can you have dementia with not enough or too little? So she reasoned that the problem isn't insulin. The problem is this insulin,
The enzyme.
the enzyme.
Right.
What breaks the enzyme. It's the next step in the process. It's like what we said about sugar and ADHD. It's not the sugar,
Right.
but the sugar begins a process
Right.
that ends up with adrenaline.
Right.
Same thing here. It's not the insulin itself. It's this enzyme
Right.
that's creating the problem.
Right. Yeah. So what is happening is that the enzyme is insufficiently breaking down the amyloid
That's right.
proteins in the brain, and that's again contributing to the presence of Alzheimer's.
Right, right.
Everybody stay keeping up with this?
That's scary.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this little enzyme. And it was interesting that this woman started to ask that question. She said, well, how can too little insulin and too much insulin both result in dementia?
Yeah.
And well, the connection is this enzyme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because the woman who did this research, she's not even a medical researcher.
Right.
She's
That
just
was the
interested
other-
in it.
That was the other thing.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, maybe it's in her family or something, and she just started to do research.
Yeah.
But there was, based on her findings, this endocrinologist did do a more thorough study. And some of this is based on his work.
Right. Yeah. So it was Roberts, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rosebud Roberts.
Right, because what he reported, this was back in 2012. Again, this is not.
And he had 1,000 people there.
Right, and they found that he studied individuals, divided them into groups, high consumers of carbohydrates versus low consumers of carbohydrates, and he found that in the individuals who had high consumption, particularly of simple carbohydrates, had an 80% higher risk for developing cognitive impairment than people who are on a low carbohydrate diet.
Right.
It's not just your waistline.
Right. Yeah. It's fascinating stuff. And again, I think that the take-home message here is that what we're doing, and it's the case with so many things, but we fail to look ahead far enough. I mean, Alzheimer's is a major issue. I mean, it's a major problem because of my grandfather passed from Alzheimer's, and it is heartbreaking to watch. It is heartbreaking to experience, and for the person who's going through it, they're experiencing these changes and things are happening, especially early on, that they don't understand because things are happening and they have no memory of these things happening. And so it's a devastating condition that may, in many ways, be preventable, or at least our risk can be significantly diminished if we start just eating better when we're younger. We take care of our body a little bit better when we're younger.
That's right. If you're not convinced yet, that you need to change your eating.
Right.
I don't know what it's going to. I mean, the evidence is so overwhelming.
Right.
That anybody who doesn't begin to take this seriously, you're gonna set yourself up for some truly debilitating illnesses that are preventable.
Right.
I mean, there's so many illnesses that are not preventable.
Right.
Here's one that is.
Type 2 diabetes is preventable.
Right.
And some of this research is suggesting that we may be able to build in the very least, reduce our risk for Alzheimer's.
The terrible irony here is that type 2 diabetes is avoidable. and yet we're creating type 3.
Right.
Instead of preventing 2, we're actually living with 2 and creating a third type.
Right.
For exactly the same reason.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other piece to this to remember is that once you have Alzheimer's, there is no cure.
These dementing disorders have a life of their own.
Right.
You're not going to.
Right.
You don't fix them.
Once those plaques and tangles get in there,
right.
you don't remove them.
Yeah, we don't have any medication.
They don't go away.
There's no medication. There's
right.
no treatment for this stuff.
Yeah, the only treatments right now are acetylcholine-based medications that, in the very best case right. scenario, just slow it down a little bit. Right. But it doesn't reverse anything. It doesn't stop it.
You know, people talk about a cure for all the... It's going to be a long way.
We're a long ways away from that.
Yeah, you're not going to fix Alzheimer's.
So while it's not curable, it is perhaps preventable.
This is another one of those things that you should prevent,
right?
Not fix.
Yeah, I think way too often, especially here in the United States, we are reactive based. We only react to things, and because of that, what we do is, we wait until there's a problem,
right,
and then we react and we try to fix that problem.
Yeah,
Instead, we need to be more proactive and find ways to prevent problems from happening in the first place.
Because so much of our medical model is based on this notion of, well, if I break it, somebody can fix it.
Right.
I get pneumonia, you can cure it. I break a bone, you can fix it. You can't fix this. Okay.
Right.
And the other thing that I found interesting in this article, but fascinating, if you're still not convinced that you should make a change, there are other theories.
Right.
That they present at the end. Say, okay, let's say it's not that. Let's talk about other things that could be causing it. Diabetes weakens blood vessels.
Right.
Okay. When blood vessels weaken, they break, especially at the ends where they're very tiny.
Right.
And that's that vascular dementia
right.
that you mentioned earlier. So if we talk about the Alzheimer's type, well, here's the vascular type.
Right.
Once again, related to diabetes.
Right.
Okay. Second, excess sugar. Excessive sugar,
right.
too much sugar, makes cells insulin resistant. And so here's another reason not to use excess sugar. And I think of people I know who consume breathtaking amounts of sugar.
Right.
I mean, I know people who drink sodas every day.
Right.
And eat sweets and eat candy and eat carbohydrates and eat bread.
Right.
And so they're just overwhelming the system.
Right.
Okay. When you do that, your cells become insulin resistant. When they become insulin resistant, they tend to die.
Right.
Okay. So your diet is killing your cells.
Right. Well, remember, we talked about this in a podcast last year sometime. There is your daily allotment of sugar. In some cases, depending on how your specific diet is, sometimes even more than your daily allotment for sugar, is contained within one 12-ounce can of Mountain Dew.
One 12-ounce can of Mountain Dew contains all the sugar.
About as much sugar as you should consume for the entire day.
Right. So if you have 2 cans...
Right.
If
you have a bottle.
If you don't eat anything...
If you just have one of the bottles.
Or if you have a 16-ounce bottle... You're above.
over.
So if you don't eat anything, you're already headed down that path.
Right.
Right. And then there's this whole fat issue. Okay.
Yeah.
Because if you're eating these things, you tend to be overweight. Okay. Fat releases cytokines. Right. Another enemy.
Right.
Okay. Because what do the cytokines do?
You were getting on to me for getting into the biochemistry.
No, but I mean, here you have, okay, we've already talked about sugar, carbohydrate, diabetes, causing these dementias. Okay, if you're not convinced, how about this? Diabetes weakens blood vessels. You get vascular dementia. You don't buy the Alzheimer's argument? How about vascular dementia? Because you're at risk for that too. How about killing off insulin cell? Okay, so those cells die. We talked about calcium. Right. Those cells die. Not convinced yet? Okay, you're getting fat. Fat causes inflammation, because the cytokines make inflammation.
Right.
So you're going to wreck your body through inflammation. I mean, there's about 4 or 5 pathways here that all say the same thing. If you're consuming too much sugar, and our Western diet has too much sugar, you're placing yourself at risk for 4 or 5 different ways. Right. You're going to hasten cognitive decline.
For any number of reasons.
And you can't reverse it.
Right.
Once you start it, you can't reverse the cognitive decline.
Right.
So please, the best thing to do is to prevent it.
Right.
And the easiest fix is you prevent it through diet.
Right. Absolutely.
Fascinating stuff.
It's good stuff.
Makes me want to go back and study endocrinology.
I know.
It's such a...
So read the article. The link is in the show notes. It's great information.
It really is a good article.
We'd love to hear what you think and any of your experiences with any of this stuff. I think it would be...
That's right. Any personal experiences dealing with elderly, any diabetes or early onset, late onset, let us know.
Yeah.
Love to hear from you about this.
Absolutely. So, all right. That is it for today.
Change your diet over the weekend.
That's right. Start today.
Today's the weekend. So
that's
change
right.
it.
All right. So until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid. Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.